She was numb, but the world around her kept spinning, each second a reminder of what she had done. The officer didn't speak as he guided her toward the door. Her legs felt like lead, unsteady beneath her, and her body moved on autopilot. The house seemed impossibly large now, the walls pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting Marc to suddenly appear, to rise up from the floor and tell her it was all a mistake. But the silence answered back. The room was empty, cold,
Dead.
and it hit her then, with the force of a punch to the gut. Marc wasn't coming back. Not ever. The officer's voice broke through the fog in her mind. "Get in the car, Mrs. Herrera."
She didn't resist.
There was no point. Her body moved on its own, as if the shock had completely taken over her mind. She slid into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that felt like a death sentence. The cool air of the night seemed to seep into her skin, biting at her, reminding her of how far she had fallen. The engine roared to life, the sirens cutting through the stillness of the street as they pulled away from the house. And all Emma could do was stare out the window, lost in the endless sea of streetlights that flickered past. Each one felt like a marker, a step closer to the end of her freedom. Her thoughts swirled in a haze, a mixture of guilt, disbelief, and fear. What would happen to her now? The trial, the sentencing. Would they believe her? Would they understand it had been an accident? Her mind refused to settle on one thought. The questions kept piling up, drowning her in a flood of uncertainty. The officer beside her said nothing. His silence was deafening. The world outside blurred as the car sped through the streets, but Emma didn't care. She barely noticed the passing buildings, the fleeting faces, or the distant hum of city life. All she could think about was Marc, the man she had loved, the man she had killed. The car turned a corner, and the lights of the police station loomed ahead, stark and uninviting. The officer didn't stop as they pulled into the lot, but Emma's eyes were fixed on the building, the place where she would be held, the place where her life, as she knew it, would end. As they approached the entrance, Emma's thoughts became a blur of dread. This was it. There was no going back. The truth had caught up with her. And there would be no escaping it now. The police station loomed before her like a prison, cold and unforgiving. The car came to a halt. The engine cut off with a final thud that seemed to echo in Emma's chest. Her breath was shallow now, each inhalation sharp and ragged. The officer beside her finally moved, opening the door with a quiet click. "Out," he said, his voice as cold as the night air that rushed in. She stepped out, her legs unsteady. Her feet felt like they were moving through thick mud, dragging her forward against her will. She was led into the building, past rows of empty desks and flickering fluorescent lights. The place felt sterile, clinical. The smell of coffee and paper mixed with a faint scent of disinfectant, but nothing could mask the suffocating tension that hung in the air. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Her eyes darted around, searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. The officer didn't speak again. He just walked ahead, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor as she followed like a ghost. They passed through a locked door and into an interrogation room, its walls bare and cold, lit by a single overhead light that seemed too bright, too harsh. The chair was hard, unforgiving. She sat down without a word, her body going through the motions as though she was no longer in control of it. The officer stepped out, leaving her alone. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, the rough surface grounding her, but it couldn't stop the swirl of panic rising in her chest. She had done something unforgivable, something that could never be undone. Her mind raced back to that night, the push, the fall, the silence afterward. She could still hear Marc's voice in her head, the words they had argued over echoing in her mind. And then the stillness, the finality. Emma's breath hitched. She shut her eyes, trying to shut it all out, but it kept coming back, replaying over and over again. The image of Marc lying motionless on the floor, his eyes wide and unblinking. The door opened with a soft creak, and she didn't have to look up to know who it was. The officer returned, flanked by another man, a detective, his presence imposing. "Mrs. Herrera," the detective said, his voice deep, controlled. "We need you to answer some questions." Emma swallowed, the dryness in her throat making her voice sound foreign, almost robotic. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's start with the basics," he said, pulling out a file from under his arm. "Where were you when your husband died?" The question hit her like a slap. She wasn't prepared for it. Not yet. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to tell him the truth. To say it had been an accident. But the weight of her confession felt too much to bear, even now. The detective leaned forward, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Herrera, we know it wasn't just a fall. We know what happened between you and your husband." The words echoed in the room. Emma's throat tightened, the walls of the small room suddenly closing in on her. She wanted to scream, to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "Tell us what happened," the detective pressed, his voice low and firm. Emma's fingers dug into the table, the rough edges scraping against her skin. She took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. And then, in that moment of crushing vulnerability, she whispered the truth. "I pushed him. I didn't mean to, but I pushed him." Her voice cracked as the confession tore through her, and with it, every bit of the life she had once known slipped further away. The detective didn't speak. He just watched her, his face unreadable. And Emma felt the heavy burden of her guilt settle in her chest like a stone. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. There was no escape. The silence that followed her confession was suffocating. Emma could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the frantic beating of her heart. The detective didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable, like he was dissecting her every word, every twitch. She felt exposed, vulnerable, small, as if the walls of the room had closed in around her, trapping her in her own guilt. I didn't want to," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't." But it was too late for excuses. Too late for explanations. The detective's gaze softened, but just for a moment. And then he spoke, his voice still firm, but less cold. "Mrs. Herrera, we know this is hard, but we need you to be honest with us. You said you pushed him, but we need to know everything. What happened after?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. Her fingers were still gripping the edge of the table, but they were no longer steady. I didn't know what to do." Her voice faltered. "I just froze. I couldn't think straight. I saw him on the floor, and I thought maybe he'd get up. But he didn't. He just stayed there." Her words trailed off as she remembered the sickening stillness that had settled over the room after Marc fell. The air had been thick with something she couldn't name, something heavy and suffocating. "Did you check on him?" the detective asked, his voice quiet now, almost like he was trying to pull her deeper into the truth. I thought I should call someone," Emma murmured, her eyes not meeting his. "But I didn't. I don't know why. I just didn't." The weight of those words hung between them like a rope, tightening with each passing second. She had left him there. She had abandoned him. Her mind was a blur. She didn't know how much time had passed before she'd finally made the decision to leave. Had it been minutes? Hours? She couldn't remember. The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't call for help. You didn't try to get him help. Why?" Emma's chest tightened as she met his gaze for the first time. The truth felt too raw, too exposed.
She knew what he was asking.
And she knew there was no good answer. "I panicked," she said, the words barely escaping her lips. "I didn't know what to do. I thought it was too late. I thought I was the one who'd caused it." The confession was harder this time. Her voice trembled with the admission. The detective didn't respond immediately. He just sat back in his chair, studying her, weighing her every word. And in the silence, Emma felt the crushing weight of her actions settle over her like a storm. Every second of indecision, every moment she had hesitated, it had all led to this. The sound of the door opening startled her, and a second officer stepped inside, his face impassive. The detective glanced up at him before turning back to Emma. "We'll need to take you in for further questioning," he said, his tone firm once more. "And we'll be placing you under arrest." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She could barely breathe, could barely process what was happening. Her chest tightened as she stood up, the weight of the handcuffs biting into her wrists as they led her out of the room. The cold air of the station felt like ice on her skin, but she couldn't feel it. She couldn't feel anything. All she could hear was the sound of her own voice repeating over and over in her head. I pushed him. I pushed him, asterisk. And with that, everything she had known, her life, her marriage, her future, disappeared into the shadows of the past. There was no turning back now. Emma had crossed a line, and no amount of regret or sorrow could ever undo it. The cold metal of the handcuffs scraped against her wrists as they guided Emma through the sterile hallways of the police station. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her actions was pressing her down, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, the dull, gray tiles stretching out endlessly before her. She didn't dare look up. The air was thick with tension, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights above adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The second officer's footsteps echoed beside her, his presence like a shadow that would never leave. Her mind was spinning. The room, the questions, the interrogation. Everything had happened so fast. And now, she was being led toward a holding cell, a place where time would drag on forever. Her stomach churned as she imagined the cold, concrete walls closing in on her. Would they throw her in with the others? The criminals, the broken, the lost? She couldn't even think about it. Her mind was still on Marc, his lifeless body flashing in her thoughts like a silent warning.
What would happen to him now?
Would his family ever forgive her? Would anyone ever understand that it wasn't supposed to happen this way? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the questions, the guilt, the shame. The officer stopped in front of a cell, unlocking the door with a metallic click. He opened it slowly, and Emma was pushed forward. The coldness of the cell hit her instantly, a rush of chill that seemed to sink into her bones. She stepped inside, her legs giving out just as the door slammed shut behind her. For a moment, she stood there, her back pressed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was tiny, just a small cot with thin, scratchy blankets and a rusted toilet in the corner. The walls were bare, cold concrete that felt as if it had been carved out of stone. She felt so small, so insignificant. It wasn't just the physical space that felt suffocating, it was the weight of her own mind, her own thoughts, closing in on her. She sank down onto the cot, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hands shook, and she placed them on her lap, trying to steady them, but the tremors wouldn't stop. It felt like the entire world had crumbled beneath her feet, and all she could do was watch as the pieces scattered, beyond her reach. A sudden thought pierced through the fog in her mind. How could I have done this? How had things gotten so far? The answer was simple, but it was something she didn't want to accept. It had been her own anger, her own brokenness. She had let it all boil over in that one moment, that one mistake. Marc hadn't deserved what happened to him. No one deserved that. And yet, here she was, paying the price for it. The sound of footsteps echoed again, closer this time. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest, but it was only a guard passing by. The brief interruption did nothing to ease her nerves. The hours stretched on. The dull, hollow noise of the station filled her ears, a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. She was a prisoner of her own choices. The time seemed to crawl, dragging its feet as the weight of the hours piled up. Emma didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind was too full, too restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marc's face. Every time she tried to push the memory away, it came back stronger. Her hands were still trembling when the door to the cell finally opened again, the harsh light of the hallway spilling into the darkness. The officer returned, his face as unreadable as before. "Mrs. Herrera," he said, his voice flat. "You have a visitor." "A visitor?" Her breath caught in her throat, confusion and fear rushing through her. Who could it be? She didn't have family here. Not anymore. She had no friends left. Not after everything. The officer didn't say anything else. He just motioned for her to follow. Her legs were stiff as she stood, but she followed him without a word, her mind racing.
Who could it be?
As they walked down the hallway, the echoes of her footsteps seemed to merge with a pounding in her chest. The door to the visitor's room was open, and as they reached it, Emma saw a figure sitting at the table inside. Her breath caught. It was her lawyer, but his expression, tight, exhausted, and serious, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a visit of reassurance. This was the beginning of something much darker. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and the room's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glow over the scene. The lawyer sat across the table, his fingers steepled in front of him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't offering any comfort. Emma's heart sank as she took the seat opposite him, the cold metal of the chair sending a shiver up her spine. "Mrs. Herrera," the lawyer began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something darker, something more serious. "We need to talk about your case." His words were a sharp contrast to the heaviness in the room. She felt a lump form in her throat, swallowing hard, trying to push it back. She nodded numbly, not sure what to say, how to react. Her mind was still racing, still stuck on Marc, the push, the silence, the blood. "I've reviewed the evidence," he continued, his eyes fixed on her, calculating. "And there are few things we need to prepare for. The prosecution has already gathered their case." Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Her stomach twisted. "They're going to charge you with second-degree murder." The words hit her like a punch. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the room spun. Second-degree murder. The reality of the situation slammed into her chest like a wave, and she had to fight to keep from collapsing. She had known it was coming, hadn't she? She had known this was more than just a tragic accident. But hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. And suddenly, the walls of the small room felt like they were closing in, too tight, too suffocating. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out.
Her head spun.
Her thoughts were a blur of confusion and disbelief. Marc was dead. She had pushed him. And now, she was being charged with murder. The lawyer didn't wait for her to speak. He was already rifling through his briefcase, pulling out a stack of papers and laying them out on the table in front of her. "These are the initial charges," he said, pointing to the papers. "The evidence is circumstantial, but it's strong. The prosecution is going to argue that the push wasn't an accident, that it was intentional." Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She hadn't meant to hurt Marc. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But in that moment, when the rage had consumed her, when she had pushed him, she couldn't deny it. She had crossed a line. She had done something unforgivable. The lawyer paused, his eyes scanning her face, waiting for some reaction. But all Emma could do was stare at the table, her hands trembling in her lap. The lawyer cleared his throat, and then, almost as if he were speaking to himself more than to her, he continued, "You've got two options. We can go to trial, and I'll do my best to defend you. But based on the evidence, it's not looking good. The prosecution has a solid case for second-degree murder." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "you can consider a plea deal. They might offer you a lesser sentence if you plead guilty to manslaughter." Manslaughter. Her mind reeled at the thought of pleading guilty to anything. But at the same time, the weight of the charges felt unbearable. She could already see herself in prison, years and years of her life stolen away, all because of one mistake. One moment of uncontrollable anger. "Plea deals?" Emma's voice cracked, barely a whisper.
"So what?"
"I go to prison anyway." The lawyer didn't sugarcoat it. "It's possible, but with the right deal, it might be less time. It could mean fewer years, some leniency on the sentencing." Emma closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The world around her seemed to vanish. All she could think of was Mark's lifeless body, his empty eyes staring at her, accusing her of everything. "I never meant to hurt him," she whispered, barely able to speak the words. "I know you didn't," the lawyer said, his voice softer now. "But intent doesn't always matter in the eyes of the law. They'll argue that you acted recklessly." She swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "You have to decide if you're willing to fight this," he said finally, his tone serious. "If you're willing to take the risk of a trial, knowing what the outcome could be." Emma's mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. The trial, the plea deal, the consequences. Could she live with the guilt of pleading guilty to something she wasn't sure she had done intentionally? Could she live with the uncertainty of a trial, the chance of a much harsher sentence? Her heart raced, her thoughts spinning, and for a moment, she wished she could just escape from this whole nightmare. But there was no escape. There never had been. The decision, whatever it was, would be hers to make. And as the lawyer sat across from her, waiting for an answer, Emma knew that whatever choice she made, it wouldn't bring Mark back. And it wouldn't take away the guilt that would haunt her forever. The silence in the room felt suffocating, thick with the weight of decisions Emma wasn't ready to make. The lawyer's eyes were on her, waiting for response, but she couldn't find the words. Her mind was too clouded by the storm of guilt, fear, and confusion swirling inside her. A part of her wanted to scream that she never meant to push Mark, that it had been a mistake that spiraled out of control. But she knew that wasn't how the law would see it. The truth, the brutal reality, was that Mark was dead, pressing down on her, suffocating her. I can't decide," she finally whispered, her voice hollow, lost. The lawyer nodded slowly, his expression one of understanding, though his eyes were still calculating, as if weighing the very life of his client in front of him. "I know this is overwhelming, Mrs. Herrera," he said, his voice low. "But you need to make a decision soon. If we go to trial, it could take months. The longer we delay, the more pressure the prosecution will apply." She nodded numbly, trying to process his words, but they felt distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away. Mark's face filled her mind again. His smile. The way he had looked at her with such trust, such love. Had she ever really loved him? She wasn't sure anymore. Her thoughts drifted back to that night, to the argument, to the push. The anger, the frustration, the blind rage that had consumed her for just a split second. And then everything had changed. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the haunting image of Mark's lifeless body on the floor. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, though she knew it didn't matter. The law didn't care about intention. It only cared about what had happened. The lawyer's voice was soft but insistent, cutting through the fog in her mind. "You need to think about your future, Emma. Do you want to risk everything on a trial? Or do you want to take the plea deal and move forward with your life, even if it means serving time?" Her throat closed up again. The words caught in her chest, and she couldn't answer. How could she? How could she ever move forward when Mark was gone? When she had taken his life, no matter how unintentional. "I didn't want to kill him," she said again, more forcefully this time, as if trying to convince herself of the truth. I just lost control. For a moment, I lost control." The lawyer didn't respond, just stared at her, waiting for her to find her answer. The truth was, Emma wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. She wasn't sure she deserved to have a future. The guilt was suffocating, and the fear of facing the consequences of what she had done was almost too much to bear. But still, somewhere deep down, she knew that she had to make a choice. And as the minutes stretched on in that cold, sterile room, Emma felt the weight of her decision settle upon her like a storm ready to break. She looked up at her lawyer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to fight this. I just want it to end." The lawyer's eyes narrowed, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of her words. He didn't speak for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. If you're sure about this, we'll begin the process of negotiating the plea deal. It's not ideal, but it might give you some chance of a reduced sentence. It might give you a chance to rebuild your life after the prison time, of course. Emma's chest tightened again, the words sinking in like a stone. Rebuild her life? What kind of life could she have after this? After what she had done? There was no going back. There was no undoing the damage. Is that really all there is? She asked, her voice trembling. A plea deal or a trial? No hope? No chance for something else? The lawyer's gaze softened slightly, but he didn't sugarcoat the reality. Unfortunately, no. There are no magic solutions here, Mrs. Herrera. What happened is a tragedy, and the law has to take its course. Emma felt the tears welling up again, hot and fast, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, a mixture of grief and regret. She had already lost everything. Her life. Her marriage.
Marc.
She wasn't sure what was left to fight for anymore. I'll take the plea, she said finally, her voice quiet, resigned. Whatever it takes to end this. I'll take the plea. The lawyer nodded, making a note in his file. I'll begin the process immediately. We'll get this moving. Emma felt numb as he stood to leave. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone again in the cold, sterile room. She stared at the wall, her mind empty, but for one thought that kept echoing in her head. I killed him. I killed Marc. Her tears were the only thing that felt real anymore. And as she sat there, trapped in her own guilt, the finality of it all settled around her. The story of her life, the one she had once thought was full of promise and love, had come to a tragic end. And there was no undoing what she had done. The minutes stretched into hours. Emma sat in the small, sterile room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding onto something, anything, just to keep herself tethered to reality. But there was nothing left to hold on to. She had made her choice, and now she was waiting for the consequences. The lawyer had left with a promise to initiate the plea deal, but the emptiness inside her only deepened. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of remorse, confusion, and despair. Her mind kept returning to that moment. The argument. The push. The look in Marc's eyes as he fell. The stillness afterward. The guilt that gnawed at her, eating away piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the hollow ache of what she had done. The door creaked open again, this time more softly, as if the sound of it was almost afraid to disturb the heavy silence. Emma didn't look up. She had stopped hoping for anything. But then she heard his voice, low and familiar. Emma. She froze. The world seemed to stop, and for a moment, she didn't know if she had imagined it. But then she heard it again, sharper this time, tinged with the unmistakable strain of pain. Emma. She looked up slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him standing in the doorway. It wasn't the lawyer. It wasn't a guard. It was a face she hadn't seen in years. Her brother, David. His eyes were wide, haunted, and he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, broken and lost. David, her voice cracked, the name barely a whisper. The tears she had been holding back for so long finally broke free, spilling down her cheeks. Her brother stepped into the room, his face twisted with pain as he looked at her, standing there in the cold, grim holding cell, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. "What have you done, Emma?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. What the hell happened? Emma couldn't find the words. There were no words for the wreckage of her life, for the person she had become. "I didn't mean to," she said through broken sobs, her voice raw with guilt. "I didn't mean to hurt him, David. I didn't mean to kill him." David stepped forward, his face softening with some mixture of sympathy and frustration, but his eyes never left hers. "Tell me what happened," he demanded gently, his tone just shy of pleading. Emma shook her head, the weight of her emotions making it impossible to keep herself together. She didn't know how to explain what had led to that moment.
How could she?
How could she explain to him that one argument, one push, had spiraled into something irreversible, something that had taken Marc's life and shattered her own? She wiped her eyes, trying to focus, trying to find some clarity in the fog of her thoughts. It started as just frustration, she said, her voice unsteady. We were fighting, like we always did. But that night, it was different. He said something. And I don't know. I just snapped. David's eyes darkened as he listened, his expression unreadable. I just wanted him to stop, she continued, her voice trembling. I didn't think. I just pushed him, and then he fell. And I thought he would get up. I thought he would be angry, but he didn't move. He didn't get up. Her breath hitched again, and her chest tightened as the weight of the memory crushed her. Her brother didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there, watching her, trying to process the words. Finally, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You have to understand, Emma, he said quietly, his voice full of pain. What you did, it's not something that can just go away. You can't just erase it. But you need to stop blaming yourself for something that wasn't all your fault. No one forced you to push him, but Marc was not. He wasn't the same person you remember. I know he wasn't. Emma's eyes flickered to the floor. She knew what he was implying. Marc had changed, hadn't he? But did that make it right? Did it excuse her actions? Her brother stepped closer, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder. I'm not saying you're not responsible, he said softly, but you're still my sister. I'll be here for you, Emma.
You're not alone in this.
His words, so full of compassion, felt like a small lifeline in the ocean of her guilt. But they also felt like a cruel reminder that no matter how much he loved her, no matter how much he wanted to help her, the truth still remained. Marc was gone. And Emma had been the one to end his life. She looked up at David, her voice barely a whisper. How do I live with this? How do I live with the fact that I killed him? David didn't have an answer. Neither did she. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma didn't feel quite as alone. The path ahead of her was still dark, still uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, with her brother by her side, she could find some way to carry the weight of her guilt, to live with the consequences of what she had done, to face whatever was left of her shattered life, and somehow try to put the pieces back together. Even if it would never be the same again, the days blurred together as Emma sat in her cell, a numbness settling over her that she couldn't shake. Her lawyer had been working on the plea deal, and though she had made her choice, the weight of that decision continued to hang over her like a cloud, blocking out any hope of relief. David had come to visit a few more times, always with that same quiet support. But the more she saw him, the more she realized that she couldn't let him carry the weight of her actions, too. He had his own life to rebuild, his own way to move forward. And Emma? She was trapped in her own prison, one that extended far beyond the walls of her cell. The courtroom date loomed. The plea deal had been finalized. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they could negotiate. Manslaughter. It was a far cry from the second-degree murder charge she had initially faced, but it was still a lifetime of regret wrapped in a prison sentence. She would have time to think, time to reflect, time to atone in whatever way she could. But the thought of spending the next decade or more in prison, knowing that Marc's family would never see him again, knowing she had been the one to take him from them, gnawed at her. Her heart ached as she sat alone in her cell, staring at the dull, gray walls. Her thoughts were chaotic, a whirlwind of guilt, sorrow, and fleeting moments of anger at herself. And then, there was the realization that, in a twisted way, she had lost more than Marc. She had lost herself. The version of her who had once dreamed of a future, who had loved without reservation, who had been capable of joy. All of that felt so distant now, like a life she had never lived. The heavy door to her cell creaked open. Emma turned, expecting the usual guard. But it wasn't a guard. It was the lawyer. He stepped into the cell, his face drawn and serious. "Emma," he said softly, taking a step closer, "it's time." Her heart dropped. The plea deal was final. There would be no more waiting. Emma stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her bones. It was over, and as the officer handcuffed her and led her toward the courtroom, she knew she was walking toward her future, whatever it might be. The path was still unclear, still fraught with pain. But she would face it. Alone or not, she would face the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. She couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could find some way to begin again. Even if it meant starting from the very bottom, the courtroom was cold, its walls towering over Emma as she stood at the defendant's table, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her heart pounded, every beat echoing in the silence that enveloped the room. She could barely breathe, her hands trembling at her sides, though she tried to steady them. The lawyers, the judge, the jury, all were mere shadows in her mind, their faces blurring together as she focused on one thing, one image, over and over again.
Marc.
Marc's face haunted her thoughts, as it always had in the days since that fateful night. She had thought about him constantly, the way his smile had once lit up the room, the way he had loved her unconditionally. She had thought about the argument, the push, the fall. She had replayed every moment until it had become her entire reality. And now, in this sterile, oppressive space, she could almost feel him watching her, the weight of his absence pressing down on her soul. The judge's voice cut through the fog of her thoughts, signaling the beginning of the hearing. The plea deal was about to be finalized. It was a formality, but for Emma, it was the final step in a journey that had started with that single, terrible decision. Her lawyer had advised her to take the plea. It was her best chance at avoiding the harshest possible sentence. But even then, she knew nothing could truly make things right. Nothing could undo what she had done. As the prosecutor read through the details of the deal, Emma's mind wandered again, not to the courtroom but to the quiet moments she had spent alone with her brother David. She could still hear his words, soft but firm, telling her that it wasn't too late to begin again, that there would always be a way to move forward. But could she? The gavel came down with a sharp crack, jolting her back to the present. The deal had been struck. The charge of manslaughter had been accepted, the sentence was decided, years in prison but not a lifetime. Not the life sentence she had feared. Emma stood there, numb. The room around her was silent, except for the rustling of papers and the shifting of bodies. She wasn't sure if she felt relief or more sorrow. But as she was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed once more, a strange sense of finality washed over her. This was it. The consequence. The atonement. She would spend her days in prison, paying for her crime, but in some way, she knew she had already been serving her sentence, in her heart, in her soul. It wasn't just the years ahead that would hold her captive. It was the memory of Marc. She couldn't change the past, but she could face the future. With each step, Emma knew that, for better or worse, she was moving forward.